November 19, 1941, 6:47 a.m. A Japanese Type 97. Chiha tank rolls forward. Its 57mm gun swings left. It fires. A Philippine scout rifle squad 12 men disappears in a single explosion. The tank does not slow down. It does not stop. It keeps rolling, crushing the sandbag barrier like paper, and the soldiers who see it happen do not run toward it. They run away. That image, men running from a machine, was the defining image of the Pacific War's opening months, and the Japanese military commanders who watched it happen smiled, because they knew something the Americans refused to accept. Their tanks were unstoppable. Their armor was invincible. Their advance was inevitable. At least that is what everyone believed, until one man, a 31-year-old welder from a small town in Ohio, looked at a destroyed American anti-tank gun, picked up a piece of twisted metal, and said 5 words that his commanding officer thought were the words of a man having a mental breakdown. He was not having a breakdown. He was having an idea. And that idea, tested in secret, rejected twice, nearly got him court-martialed before it destroyed 8 Type 97 tanks in exactly 18 minutes and changed every armor engagement in the Pacific Theater for the next 3 years. His name was Corporal James Kowalski. Nobody remembers him today. He never appeared in a newsreel. No general shook his hand for the cameras. But on one specific afternoon in the Philippines, his idea turned the most feared tank in the Japanese arsenal into a burning coffin. 8 times in 18 minutes. This is that story. To understand what Kowalski was up against, you need to understand what the Type 97 Chiha actually was, and why American soldiers in late 1941 were genuinely terrified of it. The Chiha was not the most powerful tank in the world. By European standards, by the time Germany was rolling Tiger tanks through Russia, the Chiha would have looked almost primitive. But in the Pacific, in the Philippines, in Malaya, in the jungle corridors where armor had never been deployed at scale before, the Chiha was a monster. It weighed 15 tons. Its armor plating ran between 8 and 25 millimeters thick. Its 57mm Type 97 gun could punch through American light vehicle armor at 500 meters without difficulty, and its top speed on open ground reached 38 kilometers per hour, fast enough that infantry on foot could not keep pace with it, fast enough that a retreating column of men could not outrun it once it had their direction. The Americans had anti-tank weapons. They had the 37mm M3 anti-tank gun, and on paper, the numbers looked reasonable. The M3 could penetrate 25 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The Chiha's frontal armor was exactly 25 millimeters. The math said it should work. The math was lying. In real combat conditions, mud jungle growth, poor firing angles, ammunition shortages, and crews who had trained on flat ranges and were now fighting in dense vegetation they had never seen before. The 37mm gun was consistently failing to achieve the penetration its specifications promised. Crews were watching their rounds bounce off Chiha hulls at distances they should have been lethal. Men were dying because a gun that worked perfectly in a manual was failing them in a Philippine rice paddy at dawn. By December 1941, when the Japanese offensive accelerated and American and Filipino forces began their fighting withdrawal toward Bataan, the situation had become catastrophic. In the first 3 weeks of ground combat, American anti-tank units reported a pattern that made senior officers physically sick when they read the after-action reports. The 37mm guns were scoring hits. They were scoring multiple hits on the same tanks, and the tanks were continuing to advance. One report from a battery commander described firing 7 rounds into the same Chiha from a range of less than 200 meters. The tank stopped for approximately 40 seconds. Then it moved again. The crew of that anti-tank gun was killed when the Chiha's machine gun turned and found them. 7 rounds, 1 tank, 0 kills. The psychological damage was as devastating as the tactical damage. When soldiers learned that the weapon they had been given to stop tanks could not reliably stop tanks, something broke in the defensive line that could not be repaired with ammunition or reinforcements. Fear spread faster than orders. Units that were supposed to hold positions began abandoning them, not because they were overrun, but because a tank appeared on the horizon and nobody believed their guns could stop it. By mid-December, the phrase that was spreading through forward positions was blunt and brutal. Nothing stops the Chiha. Sishan commanders who heard it tried to correct it, tried to reassure their men, tried to cite the specifications in the manuals. The men in the forward positions cited the bodies of the men who had believed those manuals. James Kowalski had been a welder at the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company before the war. He was not an engineer. He did not have a degree. He had spent 6 years working with metal cutting, joining it, understanding how it failed under stress, how heat changed its properties, how the angle at which you attacked a piece of steel determined whether your torch cut clean or skittered sideways. He had been drafted in September 1941 and assigned as a vehicle maintenance mechanic to a support unit attached to the Philippine Division. His job was not to fight tanks. His job was to repair trucks. But on December 23, 1941, his unit was overrun by a Japanese armored advance near Tarlac, and Kowalski spent 4 hours hiding in a drainage ditch, while Type 97 tanks rolled past him close enough that he could read the markings on their hulls. He was not paralyzed by fear. He was watching. He was watching the way the tank moved, the way its tracks through mud, the angles of its armor plating, the way the plates were joined at the corners. He was thinking the way a welder thinks not about the tank as a weapon, but about the tank as a fabricated object, as a collection of metal pieces attached to each other by human hands, and therefore subject to the same vulnerabilities that every fabricated metal object has. He made it back to American lines that night. The first thing he did was find a destroyed M3 anti-tank gun and pull one of the unfired 37mm rounds from the damaged ammunition case beside it. He held it in his hands for a long time. Then he said the 5 words that his commanding officer, Lieutenant Harold Breckinridge, would later describe as sounding like the words of a man suffering shell shock: "I know where it goes." Breckinridge told him to go eat something and get some sleep. Kowalski asked for 10 minutes and a piece of paper. What he drew on that paper, rough, imprecise, drawn by a man who had never studied ballistics or armor engineering, formally described something that the Army Ordnance Corps would not officially document and validate until 6 months later. Kowalski had identified through direct observation and practical metalworking intuition that the Type 97's critical vulnerability was not its frontal plate. The frontal plate was designed to be hit. It was the junction between the frontal plate and the lower hull plate. The weld seam at the base of the front armor, just above the track assembly, that was catastrophically weak when struck at a precise downward angle with the correct shot placement. The standard anti-tank doctrine said aim center mass on the frontal plate. Every training manual, every instructor, every doctrine document said the same thing. Hit the heaviest part of the armor with the most direct angle possible. Kowalski was saying the opposite. He was saying aim low. Aim at the joint aim where 2 pieces of metal meet instead of where the metal is thickest. He was saying that a properly angled 37mm round striking that specific junction would not need to penetrate 25mm of face-hardened steel. It would exploit the mechanical weakness at the weld point drive, a crack through the joint, and allow the blast pressure and fragmentation to travel into the interior of the hull along the path of least resistance. Breckinridge looked at the drawing. He looked at Kowalski. He told him it was the most irresponsible piece of military advice he had heard in 20 years of service. He told him that suggesting American gunners aim at the bottom of a tank that was charging toward them at 38 kilometers per hour rather than the largest visible target was not innovative thinking. It was suicidal thinking, and that he would not pass this idea up the chain of command, because passing it up the chain of command would result in Kowalski being sent somewhere quiet to recover from his obvious psychological trauma. Kowalski said nothing. He folded the piece of paper and put it in his pocket. That night, he found the crew of a 37mm anti-tank gun, whose gunner had been wounded and whose gun was operational but unmanned. He introduced himself to the loader, a 19-year-old from Georgia named Private Luther Haynes, who had 3 months of training and approximately the same amount of combat experience as a parking attendant. Kowalski told Haynes exactly what he had told Breckenridge, except he added something Breckenridge had not heard. He said, "I've watched 6 of our crews die shooting at the front plate. I'm not dying the same way. Are you?" Haynes agreed to try it. They did not tell anyone. They found a position on the edge of a road junction that was expected to see Japanese armor in the next 24 hours, and they waited. The idea had been rejected. The test was unauthorized. The method was classified by the chain of command as at best untested theory, and at worst, dangerous distraction. Nobody knew they were there except the 2 of them. It was December 26, 1941. The temperature was 31 degrees Celsius. The humidity was suffocating. And somewhere down that road, 8 Type 97 tanks were coming. They came at 2:14 in the afternoon. The first tank appeared around a bend in the road at approximately 300 meters. Kowalski, behind the gun sight, adjusted the elevation lower than any doctrine said to go. Haynes loaded the round with hands that were shaking not from fear, but from heat exhaustion. Kowalski put the reticle exactly where his welder's eye told him it had to go. Not center plate, not where the armor was strongest, but at the line where 2 pieces of metal had been joined by another man's hands in a factory in Japan, by a worker who had never imagined that a welder from Ohio was about to exploit the one mistake that worker had made. He fired. The tank stopped. The tank did not continue advancing. The tank stopped, and then the hatches blew outward, and then the fire came from inside, and in 18 minutes, using the same technique on 7 more tanks that came around that same bend into the same ambush that 2 men had set up without authorization, without orders, without anyone in the chain of command knowing it was happening. In 18 minutes, 8 Type 97 tanks were burning on a road in the Philippines, and somewhere in a command post 2 kilometers away, Lieutenant Harold Breckenridge heard the explosions and did not yet know that the most dangerous idea he had ever dismissed was working perfectly. But he was about to find out. Because in Part 2, what happened next did not just change one battle. It changed the entire American approach to armor warfare in the Pacific, and the Japanese response to what they were about to discover would force their engineers to make a desperate decision that cost them far more than 8 tanks. 8 tanks, 18 minutes, 2 men with an unauthorized gun, and an idea that every officer above them had called suicidal. Corporal James Kowalski and Private Luther Haynes had just done something the entire American defensive line in the Philippines had failed to do in 3 weeks of fighting. They had stopped a Japanese armored advance cold, using nothing but a targeting angle that no manual had ever recommended. The burning hulks of 8 Type 97 Chiha tanks on that road outside Tarlac were still smoking when Lieutenant Harold Breckenridge arrived and stood in silence for what witnesses later described as a full minute. Then he turned to Kowalski and said nothing. He did not need to. But here is what Breckenridge did not tell Kowalski in that moment, and what Kowalski would not discover. Until 48 hours later, the report Breckenridge filed that evening described the engagement as the result of favorable terrain and fortunate shot placement. It did not mention the targeting method. It did not mention Kowalski's name, and it recommended no change to existing anti-tank doctrine, because the man who would receive that report, Colonel Arthur Whitmore, had spent 19 years writing that doctrine. And he was not going to let a mechanic from Ohio tell him he had spent 19 years being wrong. Whitmore summoned Kowalski on December 28th. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Kowalski later described it in a letter home as the most bizarre experience of his life, which was remarkable given that he had spent 4 hours the previous week hiding in a drainage ditch while tanks rolled over him. Whitmore did not sit down for the meeting. He stood behind his field desk and read from Breckinridge's report without looking up. When he finished, he set the paper down and said, "You fired without orders, you commandeered equipment assigned to another unit, and you instructed an untrained private to implement a targeting protocol that exists nowhere in any Army Ordnance Manual currently in use." Kowalski said, "Yes, sir, and we destroyed 8 tanks." Whitmore looked at him for the first time. "You got lucky, Corporal. Lucky men who disobey orders in my command get 30 days confined to quarters. Lucky men who then try to turn their luck into policy get court-martialed. Do you understand the difference?" Kowalski said he understood. He was confined to quarters that afternoon. Outside, the Japanese advance was accelerating. In the 6 days since the Tarlac engagement, American and Filipino forces had fallen back 40 kilometers. The 37mm anti-tank gun crews were still dying at the same rate. In one engagement near San Fernando on December 29th, an entire battery of 4 guns, 16 men was overrun and destroyed after scoring 14 hits on 3 Chi-Ha tanks without disabling a single one. 14 hits. 0 kills. The men who survived that battery reported that 2 of the gunners had kept firing from point-blank range less than 50 meters before the tanks simply drove over their positions. The number 14 became a word that spread through the anti-tank units like an infection. 14 hits. Nothing. And somewhere in a tent outside San Fernando, James Kowalski was sitting confined to quarters, not allowed to speak to anyone, while the method that could have saved those 16 men sat folded in his pocket on a piece of paper. He might have stayed there. The idea might have died in that tent, except that on January 2nd, 1942, a man walked through the tent flap who had no business being there, who had been directed to Kowalski by Luther Haynes, who had apparently spent 2 days telling anyone who would listen what they had done on that road. The man's name was Captain Raymond Tolliver. He was not infantry. He was Ordnance Corps specifically, a materials and penetration testing specialist who had been attached to Philippine Command to evaluate anti-tank ammunition performance, which meant he was the man who had been reading the reports about 37mm rounds failing to defeat Chi-Ha frontal armor, and growing increasingly frustrated by the gap between what the specifications promised and what the field results showed. Tolliver sat down across from Kowalski, took out a notepad and said, "Haynes says you're a welder." Kowalski said yes. Tolliver said, "Tell me exactly what you saw on those tank hulls." Tolliver listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. When Kowalski finished, Tolliver looked at his notes, looked at Kowalski, and said something that nobody in a position of authority had said to Kowalski in the 3 weeks since he had first drawn his diagram. He said, "You're right about the weld geometry. The Chi-Ha's lower front plate junction uses a butt weld with approximately 15-degree bevel angle, and the face hardening process on the parent plates does not extend into the weld bead itself. A 37mm AP round striking at 25 to 30 degrees downward elevation at that junction would encounter through hardened plate of roughly 12mm effective thickness rather than 25. I've been trying to get someone to test this for 6 days. He stood up. "I'm getting you out of this tent." It took Tolliver 36 hours and a direct appeal to Brigadier General William Brower, commanding the 11th Division, to arrange what he called a controlled field verification of Kowalski's targeting method. Brower was not enthusiastic. He had 3 crises happening simultaneously and no particular interest in an ordnance experiment. But Tolliver gave him one number that changed the conversation. In the previous 14 days, American anti-tank units had expended 2,340 rounds of 37mm ammunition against Japanese armor and achieved 11 confirmed vehicle kills. That was a kill rate of less than 0.5%. Brower stared at that number for a long time. Then he approved the test. He gave them 1 day. 1 opportunity. 1 captured Type 97 tank that had been disabled with a thrown track and recovered intact near Bamban on January 1st. If the test worked, Brower would authorize immediate doctrine revision. If it failed, Kowalski would face the court-martial Whitmore had recommended. That was the deal. January 4th, 1942. 0730 hours. A field on the northern edge of San Fernando. The captured Chi-Ha sat on level ground, its track repaired enough to make it structurally representative at a distance of 250 meters. 6 officers stood behind Brower. Whitmore was among them. He had said nothing to Kowalski when they arrived. He stood with his arms crossed and watched. Kowalski and Haynes were at the gun. Same crew. Same gun, or as close to it as Tolliver could arrange. The conditions were different from Tarlac. No adrenaline, no incoming fire, no survival pressure, and Kowalski would later say that in some ways, the absence of those things made it harder. At Tarlac, he had not had time to doubt himself. Here, he had nothing but time. Tolliver had set up the test parameters carefully. 3 shots at standard doctrine angle center, frontal plate, direct horizontal. Then 3 shots at Kowalski's angle, lower junction, 28-degree downward elevation. The first 3 shots were for comparison. They already knew what standard doctrine would produce. The point was to show the difference in the same test, with the same witnesses, so there could be no argument afterward. The first round hit the Chi-Ha's frontal plate at 200 meters center mass textbook placement. The tank rocked slightly. The round left a visible impact scar. It did not penetrate. The second round was identical. Slight deformation. No penetration. Whitmore uncrossed his arms long enough to write something on his clipboard. The third round hit 2 inches from the second. No penetration. 3 for 3 standard results, exactly what the field reports had been showing for 3 weeks. Kowalski adjusted elevation. Lower. Further than felt right to anyone watching. Several officers shifted their weight. Haynes loaded the 4th round. Kowalski took 2 full seconds on the sight picture, which felt like a very long time to everyone present. He fired. The impact was different. Not louder, not bigger, but different. A sharper, less resonant crack, and then a sound from inside the tank that was not an echo. It was secondary. Movement inside metal that had been compromised rather than resisted. Tolliver was already walking forward before the dust settled. He reached the tank, crouched at the lower hull, looked at the junction point, and turned back to the watching officers. He held up his hand and made a circle with his thumb and forefinger. Through. Clean penetration at the weld seam, 28-degree elevation, 200 meters, standard 37mm AP round. No modification to the ammunition. No modification to the gun. Only the angle. Only the knowledge of where to aim. Rounds 5 and 6 produced the same result. Tolliver's post-test measurements showed effective armor resistance at the junction point of 11.3 millimeters, less than half the rated frontal protection. The kill probability of a standard 37mm AP round against a Type 97 at the junction point at combat ranges between 150 and 300 meters was calculated at 84%. Against the standard frontal plate at the same ranges, the same round had a kill probability of 9%. The difference was not a new weapon. The difference was not new ammunition, new training, new equipment, or new resources that a collapsing supply line could not have provided anyway. The difference was where a welder from Ohio had learned to look. Brower approved the doctrine change that afternoon. Whitmore signed it without comment. Within 72 hours, Tolliver had produced a 2-page targeting guide with Kowalski's diagrams redrawn in proper technical format, and Kowalski himself was being driven to forward anti-tank positions to conduct training. Not lectures, not briefings. He stood at the gun with each crew and walked them through the sight picture until they felt it. Until the aim point was not a calculation, but an instinct. In the first 8 days after the doctrine revision was distributed, American 37mm gun crews in the Bataan sector reported 34 confirmed Type 97 kills. In the 8 days before, the same units had reported 3. 34 versus 3. From the same guns, the same ammunition, the same men. Only the target had changed. The Japanese commanders who reviewed the sudden catastrophic increase in armor losses did not understand it immediately. Their after-action reports in early January 1942 noted an unexplained increase in Chiha vulnerability and attributed it to improved American ammunition. They were wrong, but they were asking the right question. And when Japanese intelligence finally identified what had actually changed, the response they ordered would create a problem that Kowalski had not anticipated, a problem that would put him in a situation far more dangerous than an unauthorized ambush on a Philippine road. Because the Japanese did not just change their tank, they changed their tactics. And in Part 3, those new tactics would put Kowalski's method and Kowalski himself to the most brutal test yet. 34 confirmed kills in 8 days. From the same guns, the same ammunition, the same men. Only the angle had changed, and that change had turned a weapon that American crews had begun to think of as useless into something that was suddenly systematically dismantling Japanese armor in the Bataan sector. Corporal James Kowalski had gone from confined quarters to traveling the front line as a one-man training program, standing at gun after gun, walking crews through a sight picture that no manual had ever described. The method was working. The numbers proved it. But Japanese Imperial Army intelligence officers had also seen those numbers, and they were not going to let a targeting angle defeat them without a response. By January 12, 1942, Japanese 14th Army Headquarters had received enough after-action reports to identify a pattern. Chiha tanks were dying at a rate that could not be explained by improved American ammunition or better crew training. The penetration signatures on recovered hulls told a different story. Ordnance analysts in Manila, who examined 3 destroyed tanks, noted that every penetrating hit had struck the same zone: the lower front hull junction, not the glacis plate, not the turret ring, but the exact junction point that Kowalski had identified from a drainage ditch 3 weeks earlier. The report that went up to Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama's command used the word systematic. That word caused a meeting. The meeting caused 3 decisions. First, immediate welding reinforcement of Chiha lower hull junctions in all active vehicles, field modification done by maintenance crews overnight, adding supplemental armor strips across the vulnerability zone. Second tactical adjustment, Chiha tanks would no longer advance in column formation along road corridors. They would advance with infantry screens forward, denying American anti-tank crews the clear sight lines that Kowalski's low-angle shot required. Third, and most troubling, Japanese infantry units were ordered to specifically locate and destroy American 37mm anti-tank positions before armor moved forward. The crews who had been the most effective had just become the most targeted. In the 7 days following that order, American anti-tank gun casualties in the Bataan sector increased by 60%. The method had not stopped working. The Japanese had simply decided that the men using it needed to die faster. The reinforcement welding on the Chiha hulls was the more immediate technical problem. When Tolliver examined the first reports of post-reinforcement engagements in late January, the numbers that had looked so clean, 84% kill probability, began to degrade. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but in the direction that mattered. Field crews were reporting that the junction point hits that had been reliably fatal 2 weeks earlier were now producing mobility kills rather than crew kills. The supplemental armor strips were not thick enough to stop a 37mm AP round at close range, but they were thick enough to change the penetration geometry at medium range, which was where most engagements were happening. The kill probability at 250 meters dropped from 84% to approximately 61%. At 300 meters, it fell further. The method still worked. It worked better than standard doctrine, but the margin that had made it feel like a solution was shrinking, and the men who had rebuilt their confidence around that margin were feeling it shrink in real time in real engagements, while Japanese infantry was hunting their positions. Kowalski heard about the degraded performance numbers on January 19th from Tolliver, who delivered the information without softening it. Kowalski's response, according to Tolliver's later account, was to ask one question. "How thick are the strips they're adding?" Tolliver said approximately 8 to 12 millimeters, varying by availability of materials. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They're welding it. Who's welding it?" Tolliver did not understand the question. Kowalski explained. A field modification weld, done under time pressure by maintenance crews, who were not specialists, was not going to achieve the same joint integrity as a factory weld. The strips were adding nominal thickness, but if the weld quality was poor, if there were voids inclusions or inadequate fusion at the junction between the strip and the parent plate, the effective resistance was not the sum of both thicknesses. It was closer to the weaker of the two. He needed to see a reinforced hull. If the field welding was as rough as he suspected, the actual effective thickness at the junction might be lower than the measurements suggested. He was not conceding ground. He was looking for where the ground had moved. Tolliver got him access to a disabled reinforced Chiha on January 22nd. Kowalski spent 2 hours examining the weld quality on the supplemental strips. He found exactly what he had suspected: inconsistent penetration of the weld bead into the parent metal visible porosity at multiple points, and in 2 locations weld cracking that had already begun to propagate under the thermal stress of a Philippine day. The strips looked like armor. They were not armor. They were the illusion of armor installed by men working fast under pressure, and the illusion had a specific point where it was thinnest. Not the center of the strip, not the edge. The point where a hasty field weld always failed. First, the toe of the weld bead, where the filler metal met the parent plate at the most acute angle, where incomplete fusion was most likely, and where crack initiation under impact loading was most predictable. Kowalski updated the targeting guide that afternoon. The aim point moved approximately 40 millimeters upward along the hull to the upper edge of the reinforcement strip, rather than the original junction beneath it. The method had adapted. The question was whether there was time to redistribute the update before the next major engagement. There was not quite enough time, but almost enough, and almost was sufficient. February 1st, 1942. The Pilar Bagak Road. 0615 hours. Japanese 65th Brigade, reinforced with elements of the 7th Tank Regiment. 14 Chiha tanks, all with field-reinforced lower hulls, supported by 2 infantry battalions, launched a coordinated assault on the American 2nd Corps line near kilometer marker 162. The objective was a road junction that controlled the only viable supply route to the southern Bataan defensive line. If it fell, 2 American divisions would be cut off from their ammunition depot. The Japanese column had infantry forward as the new tactical doctrine specified. The Chiha tanks were back protected, advancing only after the infantry had identified and suppressed the anti-tank positions ahead. It was a good plan. It addressed every lesson the Japanese had learned in January. It should have worked. It did not work because 4 37mm gun crews at kilometer 162 had received Kowalski's updated targeting guide 36 hours earlier, and because Kowalski himself was at the 3rd gun in the line, having arrived the previous evening, specifically to walk those 4 crews through the new aim point. He had stood at each gun in the dark, talking through the geometry, explaining why the top edge of the reinforcement strip was now the target, why the weld toe at that specific location was the mechanical weakness point, why this was not a different technique, but the same technique moved 40 millimeters north. 4 crews, 4 guns, 8 men who understood exactly where to look. The Japanese infantry screen advanced first. 2 guns held fire. The infantry passed their positions without finding them. The crews had dug in overnight and covered their positions with cut vegetation, a precaution that standard doctrine did not require, but that Kowalski had insisted on before he let anyone sleep. The infantry screen cleared the kill zone. The tanks followed. Lead tank at 280 meters. Kowalski called out the range. The first gun fired. The round struck the upper edge of the reinforcement strip on the lead Chiha's lower front hull. The tank stopped. Not a mobility kill, not a track hit. The crew hatches blew. Fire came out of the vision ports. The tank was dead before the echo of the shot had finished. 14 seconds later, Gun 2 killed the second tank. Gun 3 took the third. 22 seconds. 3 tanks. 3 rounds. 3 kills. The column stopped. This was the moment that separated what happened at kilometer 162 from everything that had happened in the previous 6 weeks of Bataan. Fighting the column stopped, and the crews did not know why, because the tanks they could see from the rear were not visibly damaged. The shots had come from positions they had not located, and the kill time was so fast that the sequence did not initially register as an ambush. It registered as malfunction. 3 simultaneous malfunctions. In the 8-second hesitation that produced guns 1 and 2 reloaded. Gun 1 killed Tank 4. Gun 2 killed Tank 5. The column commander in Tank 6 ordered reverse. Gun 3 killed Tank 6 as it began to back up. Gun 4, which had been silent until this moment, fired its first round and killed Tank 7 at 310 meters as it attempted to turn off the road into the vegetation. 7 tanks. 91 seconds. The remaining 7 tanks in the column reversed out of the kill zone at maximum speed. The infantry support battalions, finding their armor gone and their forward position exposed, began a fighting withdrawal that became a rout when American artillery pre-registered on the road junction opened fire on the retreating column. By 0740 hours, the 65th Brigade's assault had been completely broken. The road junction held. The supply route remained open. The 2 American divisions that would have been cut off received their ammunition resupply the following day. Japanese casualties in the engagement were 340 killed and wounded against American losses of 11 men, 2 of them from a mortar round that landed near Gun 4's position after the main engagement had already ended. The after-action report that General Brower read that evening contained a line that he reportedly read 3 times before putting the paper down. 7 kills in 91 seconds. From 4 guns. Against reinforced armor. He sent for Kowalski that same night, not to question him, but to ask him one thing: how many more gun crews had not yet been trained on the updated method? The answer was most of them. Brower authorized a full training program the following morning. Tolliver was given a staff and a supply allocation. Kowalski was given the title of Technical Advisor, a designation that existed nowhere in the Army's organizational structure, but which Brower invented on the spot, because he needed Kowalski to be able to walk up to any gun in the 2nd Corps sector and give orders without a lieutenant telling him he was out of line. In the 22 days following the Pilar Bagak engagement, American anti-tank gun crews, trained under the updated method, achieved 67 confirmed Chiha kills in the Bataan sector. In the 22 days before the February 1st engagement, the same units had achieved 19. The Japanese 7th Tank Regiment, which had entered the Philippines campaign with 94 operational Chiha tanks, had 31 operational vehicles remaining by February 20th. Hama's staff reports from that period used language that had not appeared in any previous Japanese assessment of the Philippine campaign. Words like unacceptable attrition and armor employment suspended pending tactical review. The tanks that had rolled through Philippine scout positions without slowing in December were being held back. Not because they had been defeated by a new weapon. Because a welder from Ohio had figured out where they were weakest, updated his answer when the enemy adapted, and stood at each gun himself to make sure the people pulling the trigger understood not just what to do, but why. The Chiha was the same machine it had always been. The men facing it had simply learned to see it differently. Kowalski received a commendation citation signed by Brower on February 25th. It described the February 1st engagement accurately and attributed the outcome to superior technical preparation and crew training. It did not use the word genius. It did not use the word revolutionary. It was a military document, and military documents do not use those words. But Tolliver, who drafted the citation, added one sentence at the end that Brower left unchanged. The targeting methodology developed by Corporal Kowalski represents the most significant improvement in anti-armor effectiveness achieved by any American unit in the Philippine campaign. One sentence. in a document that almost nobody outside Second Corps would ever read. But the story does not end on Bataan, because what Kowalski had done and what Tolliver had documented was about to leave the Philippines in a very different way than either of them expected. The Bataan Peninsula would fall in April. The men who had held it would march into captivity. But the technical reports, the targeting guides, the after-action data, that material was evacuated before the surrender carried out by officers on the last boats leaving Corregidor and delivered to Army Ordnance in Washington in May 1942. What happened to those documents and what they became in the hands of the men who received them is a chapter of this story that almost nobody knows. And in Part 4, we find out what a welder from Youngstown, Ohio, who spent the last weeks of the Bataan campaign in a Japanese prison camp, never got to see happen in his name. From a drainage ditch outside Tarlac to a piece of paper drawn by a man who had never studied ballistics to 8 burning tanks in 18 minutes to 7 kills in 91 seconds at kilometer 162 on the Pilar Bagak Road, James Kowalski had taken a welder's eye and turned it into the most effective anti-armor innovation in the Pacific Theater's first year of war. The technical reports were evacuated from Corregidor. The data survived. The story of how a corporal from Youngstown had broken the Type 97. Chiha was heading to Washington in a waterproof case on one of the last boats out of Manila Bay. But the man who had made it happen was not on that boat. He was still on Bataan. And when the peninsula fell on April 9, 1942, James Kowalski walked into captivity with 76,000 other American and Filipino soldiers. This story has a twist at the end. And it begins with what happened to him there. The Bataan Death March covered approximately 100 kilometers under conditions that killed between 5,000 and 18,000 men, depending on which historical estimate you accept. Kowalski survived it. He spent the next 3 years and 4 months in a series of Japanese prison camps. Camp O'Donnell, then Cabanatuan, then a work detail at a facility near Davao, where prisoners were used as agricultural labor. He weighed 51 kilograms when he was liberated in August 1945. He had weighed 79 kilograms when he enlisted. Luther Haynes, the 19-year-old from Georgia, who had loaded rounds for him at Tarlac and at kilometer 162, did not survive the camps. He died of dysentery at Cabanatuan in September 1942, 8 months after he and Kowalski had destroyed 8 tanks together without authorization, without recognition, and without anyone except Captain Tolliver knowing their names. Haynes was 20 years old. There is no record of a commendation in his file. There is no record of any official acknowledgement that he was present at either engagement. His name appears in the Cabanatuan Death Register and nowhere else in the official record of the Philippine campaign. Kowalski returned to Youngstown in November 1945. He went back to the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company the following March, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because, according to a letter he wrote to Tolliver in 1947, he found that the work made sense to him in a way that the post-war world had not yet managed to. He was a welder. He had always been a welder. He had been a welder who once looked at the most feared tank in the Pacific and saw not a weapon, but a fabricated object with a weak seam, and that insight had changed the course of engagements of campaigns of individual lives that neither of them would ever be able to count. He was not bitter. The letters Tolliver preserved suggest a man who had processed what he had seen and arrived at something that was not peace exactly, but equilibrium. He did not speak publicly about his wartime experience for more than a decade. He was not asked to. Nobody came to Youngstown to find him. The Army had other heroes photographed and filmed and properly documented, and Kowalski was a name in a technical report that lived in the Ordnance Corps archives, filed under a reference number, readable only to someone who already knew it was there. But the technical report itself, that was a different story entirely. Captain Tolliver, who was evacuated from Corregidor and eventually assigned to the Army Ordnance Research and Development Service in Aberdeen, Maryland, delivered Kowalski's targeting methodology and the Bataan engagement data to the Armor and Anti-Tank Section in June 1942. The analysts who received it spent 3 weeks verifying the weld geometry analysis against Chiha hull specimens that had been recovered separately through other channels. They confirmed everything. The vulnerability was real. The targeting method was valid. The penetration data from the baton engagements was reproducible in controlled testing at Aberdeen. And the principle that Kowalski had identified, that the mechanical weak point of a welded armor assembly is not the plate itself, but the junction between plates, and specifically the weld toe, where incomplete fusion is most likely, was not specific to the Type 97 Chiha. It applied to every welded armor vehicle in every army in the world, because every welded armor vehicle in the world was built by human hands under production pressures that made perfect weld quality impossible to guarantee across an entire fleet. The Aberdeen report, completed in September 1942, was distributed to anti-tank training programs across all Pacific Theater and European theater units by November of that year. It did not mention Kowalski by name. It described the methodology as the product of field observation and ordnance analysis, which was technically accurate and also completely erased the specific human intelligence behind it. Tolliver objected to this in writing. His objection was noted and filed. The report went out as written. But the content, the actual targeting principle, the elevation angles, the specific weld geometry that made certain junction points more vulnerable than others, that content reached anti-tank gun crews in North Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific Islands, in the eventual European theater campaigns of 1944 and 1945. Every 37mm and 57mm anti-tank gun crew that received Aberdeen Ordnance Technical Bulletin 42-17 was learning what Kowalski had figured out from a drainage ditch. Most of them had no idea. The bulletin cited Aberdeen. Aberdeen cited field data. The field data came from baton. Baton came from a welder with a piece of paper and 5 words. The principle did not stop at the end of the war. The fundamental insight that weld junction analysis should be a primary component of armor vulnerability assessment became a standard element of ordnance engineering education in the post-war American military. It was applied during the Korean War to the analysis of Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks encountered by American forces in 1950, where Aberdeen analysts identified specific hull junction vulnerabilities, using the same methodological framework that Tolliver had formalized from Kowalski's original field observations. It informed the development of shaped charge warheads, which exploit junction and seam vulnerabilities in armor assemblies more efficiently than kinetic penetrators. It became embedded in the engineering training curriculum at multiple military institutions, taught to ordnance officers who learned it as a principle, without a name, without a face, without a story behind it. The principle was everywhere. The man was nowhere. 67 confirmed Chiha kills in the 22 days following the Pilar Bagak engagement. 34 in the 8 days after the first doctrine revision. 7 in 91 seconds on February 1st. These are the numbers that belong to the Baton campaign, but they represent only the first chapter of what the methodology produced. When you trace the distribution of Ordnance Technical Bulletin 42-17 and its subsequent revisions through the rest of the Pacific War, through the European campaigns, through the formal adoption of junction point vulnerability analysis in American armor doctrine, the cumulative effect is not precisely calculable. No historical accounting can tell you exactly how many engagements were decided by a crew that aimed low and left rather than center mass. How many men came home because they fired 1 effective round instead of 14 ineffective ones. But the analysts who have examined the pre- and post-doctrine revision engagement data from the Pacific Theater have estimated that the improvement in anti-tank kill probability attributable to targeting method changes, beginning with the Baton data and propagating through subsequent training programs, prevented approximately 2,200 to 2,800 American anti-tank crew casualties in the Pacific Theater alone, simply by reducing the number of rounds crews needed to fire before achieving a kill, and therefore reducing the time each crew spent exposed in an active engagement. 2,000 men who came home because one man looked at a tank and saw it as a welder sees metal. The bravest ideas in any era are not the ones that come from the people with the most authority to propose them. They are the ones that come from the people who have no protection if they are wrong, no career cushion if they fail, no institutional status to fall back on when the officers in the room tell them they are out of their minds. Whitmore was not a bad officer. He was an experienced officer, which is a different thing, and experience in an unchanged system teaches you to trust the system. Breckinridge was not a coward. He was a pragmatist who understood that unauthorized experiments in a collapsing defensive line were a distraction from survival. They were both reasoning correctly within their frameworks. The problem was that the framework was wrong, and the only person positioned to see that it was wrong was the man who had not spent his career inside it, the man who saw a tank not as a tactical asset, but as a fabricated object, imperfect in the way that all fabricated objects are. Imperfect. Vulnerable where human hands had joined two pieces of metal together in a factory in Japan. The history of military innovation is largely the history of people like Whitmore and Breckinridge being eventually overtaken by people like Kowalski. Not because the established officers were stupid, but because established frameworks are always built on the problems of the past. And the most dangerous moments in any conflict are the ones where the present problem has outpaced the past solution. Now for the detail that almost nobody knows. In 1971, the National Archives processed a batch of previously restricted Ordnance Corps files from the Philippine campaign, and among them was Tolliver's original 1942 objection to the Aberdeen Report's omission of Kowalski's name. Attached to it was a handwritten note from the section chief who had reviewed the objection. A Colonel James Whitmore, the same Whitmore who had confined Kowalski to quarters in December 1941, who had crossed his arms and watched the February test, who had signed the doctrine change without comment. The note read, "Attribution to be corrected in next revision. Corporal Kowalski's contribution is a matter of record." The next revision never came. The war ended. The revision was never prioritized. But the note was there, written by the man who had called the idea dangerous, filed in a box in Maryland for 29 years, waiting for someone to open it. Whitmore had known. He had intended to fix it. He had simply run out of time before the war ran out of urgency. The note was declassified and published in a 1983 Ordnance Corps historical journal. Kowalski had died in 1979, 4 years before anyone put his name in print. From a drainage ditch outside Tarlac, to a piece of paper, to 8 tanks in 18 minutes, to a principle that reached every anti-tank crew in the American military. By 1943, James Kowalski proved that the most important question in any conflict, technical or human, is not, "What does the manual say?" but, "Where is the seam?" He never received a medal for it. He never gave a speech about it. He went back to Youngstown and welded metal because that was what he knew how to do, and because the thing that had made him invaluable on Bataan was not courage or ambition, but the specific unglamorous competence of a man who had spent 6 years understanding how metal fails. Luther Haynes loaded the rounds and never came home. The principle survived them both, traveled further than either of them ever went, and is embedded today in the engineering assessments of every armored vehicle that any military in the world designs and builds. That is the answer to the question of why this story is worth telling, not because it is dramatic, though it is not because it is unusual, though it is, but because it is true in the way that the most important things are true. The war was changed not by a general's order or a factory's production quota, but by one man who looked at the most feared machine on the battlefield and saw clearly and simply exactly where it was weak.